Hello YouTube, this is Sam Gerrans from Qur'anite.com. Today is Saturday the 11th of May 2019, and today I'm going to be reading to you from a book that I'm not going to read all of, but I'm reading parts of, called Major Legal Systems in the World Today, 3rd edition. And this book was printed in 1985, which means that I was alive in 1985, I remember it. So this is before the kind of Muslim jihadi thing was a meme, and before Islam was really talked about in the West. And I suppose if you grew up in Great Britain, as I did, Muslims were just people who owned corner shops and made up the prices whenever they went into them, and or they worked in British Telecom, something like that. So or there were doctors. That seemed to be sort of kind of like the spread. But generally, they were pretty quiet people, and this whole thing of Islam, everyone running and hiding and jumping under their beds every time the name was mentioned. That wasn't, you may not have a memory or you may not have been alive then, but I assure you that this wasn't going on at that time. Anyway, what's interesting about this book, Major Legal Systems in the World Today, is that it's an overview of various legal systems as were extant in 1985. It includes socialist law. It covers Roman, German law, and common law, English common law, and so on. But there's a segment on what it calls Muslim law or Islamic law, and I'm just going to read some segments to you now. What's interesting about this is quite a cold and dispassionate review of legal systems. It's not sort of trying to indoctrinate people into the wonders of Islam, and nor is it trying to scream and shout about how evil it is. It's simply a historical, or it's a handbook on how legal systems work. So this is page 455. The close link between law and religion. This religion includes, first of all, a theology which establishes dogma and states exactly what a Muslim must believe, and it also includes the Sharia, which lays down rules of behavior for believers. The Sharia, literally the way to follow, constitutes what can be called Muslim law. It specifies how the Muslim should conduct himself in accordance with his religion, without making any distinction in principle between duties toward others, i.e. civil obligations and almsgiving, and those towards God, prayers, fasting, etc. It is therefore centered on the idea of man's obligations or duties rather than any rights he might have. The real sanction for these obligations is the state of sin into which the believer, neglecting them, will fall. And this is a distinction which he gets into further in the book, if you compare it to papal law, Catholic law, and so on. For this reason, Muslim law often shows very little interest in civil sanctions attached to the violation of its prescribed rules, and for the same reason, the law is only applicable to dealings between Muslims. I'm going to skip a bit. Like Judaism, Islam is essentially a religion of the law, and if I think of it, when we go deeper into this, I'll get into the comparison with Judaism, because it's a calque on Judaism, what's been created. Muslim civilization, and therefore its law, are based on the Qur'an, the sacred book of Islam, which is the collection of Allah's revelations to the last of his prophets and messengers, Muhammad. The Qur'an is unquestionably the primary source of Muslim law. It says that it's unquestionably the primary source of Muslim law, but we'll see that it actually is not even considered. It is clear, however, that its juridical provisions are inadequate as a statement of Muslim personal relations, and some of the basic institutions of Islam are not even mentioned in it. Yeah, they're not, are they? I think we can agree with that part. It talks a bit about the jurists of Al-Bukhari, Muslim, and so on. So what's interesting, you've got these supposed two forms of law, the two sources of law, being the Qur'an and what it's calling the Sunnah. But he admits here, and he doesn't have a dog in the fight. He's not really got an axe to grind, but he does say that the hadith collected some of the hadith collected are of questionable authenticity insofar as their connection with Muhammad is concerned. I would say, of course. Never mind. Let's move on to the next. Ijma'. The third source of Muslim law is the ijma', the unanimous agreement of legal scholars. Neither the Qur'an nor the Sunnah, and in spite of the latter's extended form, could answer all questions. To remedy this and to explain some apparent discrepancies in their teaching, the doctrine of the infallibility of the Muslim community, when it is in unanimous agreement, was developed. Now, in case you don't know anything about Judaism, look into the Orthodox, Rabbinic, Judaic idea about the sages, the Sanhedrin. This is what's been created here. My community, says one hadith, will never agree upon an error. Oh, really? And according to another, quote, what Muslims find to be just is just in God also, end quote. I'll just read that again. What Muslims find to be just is just in God also, end quote. This is basically saying what Muslims agree is true is true for God, is true for God. This is staggering, overweening arrogance. Ijma', based on these two maxims, has permitted recognition of the authority of solutions which are not derived directly from the Qur'an or the Sunnah. And we shall see that actually nothing is derived from the Qur'an, certainly, and even, not very much left over from what they're calling the Sunnah. We'll get into the real source of what all of this is. In order that a rule of law be admitted by ijma', it is not necessary that the mass of the faithful support it. Well, who does need to support it? Nor need it represent the unanimous feeling of all members of the community. Ijma' has nothing to do with the custom of our Western laws. The unanimity required is that of competent persons. You'll hear Muslims claim that there's no priesthood in Islam. This is nonsense. The competent persons are, well, we'll find out who they are to continue, those whose special role it is to discover and reveal the law, that is, the legal scholars of Islam. Quote, the scholars are the heirs of the prophets, end quote. By amalgamating tradition, custom and practice to form either a rule of law, a principle or an institution, the agreement of Islamic doctors and legal scholars gives the legal solution, thus unanimously accepted, the real force of juridical truth. What that's saying is there's a priesthood, and if they agree on something, that's the law. Show me that in the Qur'an. So this is a complete calque on the sages of Judaism. I'm going to skip a lot because there's lots of this. The three principles of sources of Muslim law are the Qur'an, the Sunnah and the Ijma'. But actually, the first two don't really count. But they are not of equal importance. The Qur'an and the Sunnah are fundamental sources, since the rules of the Sharia drawn up by the doctors are based on them. Today, however, they are simply historical sources. Please excuse the noise outside. They are simply historical sources. The judge no longer has to consult the Qur'an and the Sunnah directly because they have been infallibly and definitively interpreted by the ijma'. Nowadays, as a result, one has only to consult the book of fiqh, approved by ijma' in order to study Muslim law. I'm going to read that again for you. Nowadays, as a result, one has only to consult the book of fiqh, approved by ijma' in order to study Muslim law. Any qadi, i.e. Islamic judge, who would have the temerity to interpret passages of the Qur'an or to evaluate the authority of the hadiths on his own initiative would be acting disrespectfully towards orthodox belief. in the same way as a Roman Catholic who took it upon himself to interpret the meaning of texts cited by the Church in support of his dogmas would be. This was not always the case, and it gives you some sort of historical background. I'm going to shut the window. Now, I thought this was interesting. The Muslim jurist's position and psychological outlook differs even more from those of the Roman jurist. He is accustomed, writes Miliot, to think that law is made up of individual solutions to particular cases, handed down from day to day in relation to the special needs of the moment, rather than of general principles set forth a priori from which the appropriate inference will be drawn for each fresh situation. The Muslim jurist resists abstraction, systematization, and codification. He will avoid generalization and even definition. Now again, this is not a Christian critique of Islam. It's not really in that space. With the help of analogical reasoning, it is usually possible to discover from the rules of the fiqh that the required solution to any particular case. On the other hand, one cannot hope to adapt Muslim law by this means to the needs of modern society. The doctors of Islam are not concerned with this. Quote, "The fiqh is not intended to reflect reality, rather it is like a beacon guiding the faithful towards the religious ideal. And often this is a direction in which they are not progressing. The idea of adapting the fiqh to contemporary conditions is completely foreign to the system." That's a quote from a French writer, Bousquet. What this is about is what they've done is, and again, I mean, throughout my work, this is what I've discovered. What the Islamic civilization has done is it's overspecified the general. So the almost tedious refrain of "how do you pray?" It's this is it. How do you kill this heifer? And when Musa told the Bani Israel to sacrifice a heifer, what kind of heifer? What exact color is it? What type is it? Is it this? Is it this? What? It's the devil is in the detail, and this is what the Islamic world has done. So, for example, if the Qur'an tells us to be kind to orphans, what kind of orphans? How old is an orphan? How old? It just gets ridiculous. And okay, all right, so you decide you need some specificity in order to enforce laws, and I can see that there is a need for that. But what they've done is they've claimed the force of revelation on specific bylaws. And of course, any authority has got the right, and in fact, it's got the obligation to bring in bylaws, to bring in particular laws for the country, for the right ordering of the country. But what's happened is that people stopped thinking in the 10th century, and they took their definitions actually from defeated Persians and who wrote the Hadith. And so you've got this mishmash of stuff, which even this crazy mishmash it cannot even be revisited. Rejection of other sources. Here we are. For this reason, Islam regards with suspicion and generally condemns forms of reasoning which enable the law to evolve. I would just say forms of reasoning, full stop. In particular, Muslim law has refused to admit that a legal solution might be based on a believer's personal opinion or individual reasoning. That'll explain a lot, won't it, about the condition of Islamic countries. Because Muslim law is based on religious tenets, is divinely inspired and essentially non-rational. The support which derives from reason or equity would be insufficient to make such individual reasoning authoritative. Now, if we accept the Qur'an as true, it does have laws in it. There aren't very many. And this is seen by the Muslim jurist as an invitation to create a load of stuff that isn't in it. The lack of laws is actually a blessing. If you look at the Constitution of the United States, for example, it's just a page. There isn't very much of it. You can build a lot on that, but these are the basic tenets. But that's not what happens. What happens in the Islamic world is they try to claim that for every little shibboleth that was, which is rooted in case law or of the 9th century, has now got to have some sort of force of law now. Well, what this is legal quick drying cement. This is quite interesting. Comparison with canon law. Muslim law is also original when compared with the canon law of Christianity. Like canon law, it is the law of a church in the original sense. Now, the Muslims will deny this. We have no priesthood. Oh, yes, you do. That of a community of faithful. But apart from this similarity, there are very fundamental differences. Muslim law, down to its finest detail, is an integral part of Islamic religion and of the revelation that it represents. Consequently, no authority in the world is qualified to change it. Not to obey Muslim law is a sin leading to punishment in another world. He who disputes a solution of Muslim law is a heretic and thereby excludes himself from the community of Islam. Finally, a Muslim's life in society is only governed by the rules of his religion, of which Muslim law is an integral part. In all these ways, Muslim law differs from the canon law of Christian society. The spread of Christianity originally took place in a highly civilized society where law enjoyed great prestige, basically on the bones of the Roman Empire. It proclaimed new dogmas and moral principles, but it was not interested in the actual organization of society. Canon law was not a complete legal system designed to replace Roman law. It complemented Roman law or other, quote, private laws, never anything more, and regulated subjects not covered by those laws, such as church organization, the sacraments, and canonical procedure. In addition, canon law is in no sense a revealed law, although it is most certainly based on the revealed principles of Christian faith and morality. It is the work of man, and not the word of God. The Christian who violates its rules is not necessarily subject to punishment in the next world. As long as the immutable principles of dogma are respected, ecclesiastical authorities are allowed to make changes to improve or adapt it to particular circumstances of time and place. The Church of Rome itself has different canon law codes for adherence to the Latin or Eastern rites. Christian canon laws have developed enormously over the centuries and continue to do so at the present time. Under these conditions, Roman law was able to spread throughout the West without conflicting with the Christian religion. Roman law was taught in most of the universities approved by papal bulls. A papal bull is like a fatwa. The situation, quite obviously, is totally different in Muslim countries where the law is part of the revealed Islamic religion. And this is where I take issue. See, I don't believe for a second that Islamic law is part of anything revealed. The Qur'an is very clear that it's complete, it's from God, it's complete, it has a set of laws in it. That's enough. Does it mean that you don't need rules on how to drive on the roads and disputes over cutting grass and I don't know, digging up the root section of a tree on your property? Of course you need things to cover these things, but to claim that all of this is from God Almighty is, well, it's I would say it's a sin, actually, personally. And this is what the Jews have done. If you want to get a really good handle on what's happened to Islamic law, look at Judaic law, look at the Talmud, because this body of fiqh, right, which is actually where it all happens. This is the Midrash. It's actually it's a complete syncretic repetition, or almost not. It's not exactly the same, but it follows most of the general topological features of the creation of a Talmud. Now, to be fair, in pages 466 and a little bit further on, he has some very good things to say about Islamic law. And I'm going to skip those, and not because I want to give a skewed presentation, but because I don't really have time for it. And there are some advantages and flexibilities within the Islamic process and system. My concern is really what it takes as its foundations. I'm going back to first principles. And if you look at the state of the so-called Islamic world, if they were the most successful, the most innovative, with the highest achievements, and that you could probably say, oh, well, it's working, I'll just keep my mouth shut. But that's not the case. They've failed, and they've been failing for hundreds of years. So a bit like with the Jews when the temple fell, the destruction of the second temple, God finally sort of left them, and they couldn't believe that they, as the chosen race and the chosen people, had been sort of thrown on the dust cart of history. How could it be? So they developed this messianic notion that actually, it's all going to come back, and they're going to be the Übermensch, and we're all going to be sort of basically the serfs. What's happened with Islam is the idea, and it's a false idea, is that their societies have collapsed because somebody else has done it. It's the West's fault, you see. And they're going to export this medieval dysfunction into the West, and that's somehow going to prove that they were right all along. Of course, this isn't going to happen. What's actually going to happen is that the people at the top of the food chain are using so-called Muslims in order to bring about a police state in the West. They're the justification for police state. That's what's actually happening, and that's all that's happening. I mean, show me a modern Muslim country that is successful on its own money and not totally corrupt, and in which the people don't want to leave it and go and live in the West. I mean, where's your measure of success? What is this success? Even the jurists and the traditionalist Islamicists, they can't wait to get out of the countries that they create with this legal system. First opportunity to go and live in a Western country, they're on the plane. And if I came from their country, I'd be on the same plane, because they create a hellhole. And it really boils down to law. So, I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not primarily interested in all this, but fundamentally, this is the work that needs to be done, because this is how it all works. It's this distinction between the mentalities of legal reasoning, and the legal reasoning has been trapped in the 10th century. And unfortunately, what happens is that a lot of Muslims, they don't stay with the Qur'an and actually use their brains. They just think, well, obviously Islam or the Qur'an, it doesn't work. That's not true. You haven't had the chance to make it work. It's been covered with all of these accumulated crustaceans of Sunni and the Sunnah so-called, and all this other stuff. Nowhere in the Qur'an is there any of this. Not there. Read one last bit. The development of Muslim law was arrested in the 10th century with the closing of the, quote, door of endeavour. i.e. they stopped using their brains. That's 1,000 years ago now. This was the result of fortuitous circumstances and came about in an effort to overcome a crisis which threatened the Muslim world with a schism. The eclipse of the Abbasid Caliphate upon the Mughal capture of Baghdad in 1258 reinforced this conservative tendency. There are those in Islam today who doubt whether the restrictions placed on the development of fiqh at that time should be fully maintained. Should people seriously sort of limit themselves to a set of thinking which was put in place at the time of the Magna Carta? They point out, in fact, very few rules of Muslim law are based on divine revelation, I'll just read that again. They point out that, in fact, very few rules of Muslim law are based on divine revelation. Well, that would explain a lot, wouldn't it? In fact, very few. Moreover, it is only indicative of orthodox social behavior of the 7th century and not of that of today, and not even of 7th century. The 7th century as imagined and written down and promulgated 250 years later by representatives of a civilization that had been defeated by the Arabs. For the most part, Muslim law is the work of medieval jurists whose reasoning processes, I'll personally put that in inverted commas, are now out of date. Referring to the practice of the first few centuries of Islam, they point out that those who founded the rites always took special circumstances into account and made a place in their system for such notions as the purpose of the law, the public good, and necessity. They see no risk in returning to those principles today, on condition that blah, 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 blah. I mean, this book is called Major Legal Systems in the World Today, 3rd edition by René, David and John E.C. Brierley, published by Stevens, 1985. For me personally, the Islamic story of these civilizations called Islam is really just the sort of narrative of what happens when people repeat the mistakes made by the Jews. And if you want to have a good comparison, look at what the Talmud is. You see, a lot of people get very emotional about the Talmud, and they, it's this store of evil and so on and so forth. Well, it may well be. However, it is the basis of Judaic law. There's no question about it, and culture and civilization. And it's the comparison between it and this Talmudic system of medieval reasoning, which is called Islam. The comparisons are, then it's not an exact comparison, but they're pretty similar. I think what happens, especially with Westerners who read the Qur'an, is that they are usually very impressed, well, often impressed, but when they get up and personal with Islam, they start to realize this is nonsense, which well, it's not only nonsense, it's really, really quite pernicious. And they think that this is what the Qur'an's talking about, but it isn't. If you stick with it and you keep looking at the Qur'an, you find that they're completely different. So I don't know. I haven't got any final thoughts on it. I do know that men do need laws, but to claim that the way you wash your hands or the way that you, exactly how much you give in charity, all these things are defined by God, is a lie. And we read in the Quran, woe to those who write the book with their own hands and claim that this is from God. Woe to them for what they write and for what they earn. And this is what happens. Societies become backward, they retrograde, and that's what's happened. And this, as far as I can see, is the reason why. It's not because Muslim societies aren't westernized, it's because Muslim societies don't do what the West does, which is think. And the Muslim societies have this amazing treasure called the Qur'an, and they treat it like a house pet or something, like a canary in a cage. They come and look at this canary, it sings, oh, it's so beautiful, and then they go off and do their own thing. I don't know. I'll be honest. I'm glad I grew up in the West. I'm glad that I have the benefit of growing up, even with all the West's problems, and it has many, of growing up under Anglo-Saxon and Roman law, because of the way that it works. And I think if there's going to be a future, Quranic-based future, it's going to require a system of hermeneutics vis-a-vis the Qur'an, either identical to or in some way similar to the work that I've done, and then a legal process of reasoning based on that, which does not claim for itself the force of revelation. That's the only way out of this. There is no other way. So anyway, I don't know how much of this I'm going to post. I'll have a look at it and edit it down and see what I put out there. But I just wanted to share those thoughts because, when traditionalist, and I'm talking about, dyed in the wool traditionalist Muslims, when he hears the word Islam, that's what he's talking about. He's talking about this entire structure. And that has been a very specific structure, and that's not what I'm talking about. When the Quran uses the word Islam, it's using an abstract noun. An abstract noun like hope or patience. Islam, it's submission. It's an abstract noun. Submission to God. But what he's done is he's created this edifice of specificity. In my view, to claim for the edifice the same nature, the same DNA as the foundation is blasphemy, frankly. One is claiming that what one has built with one's own hands is of the same nature as what God has given you. That's my view on it. I've got nothing against legal systems. I've got nothing against specific laws, but to claim for those laws the same stuff as what God sent down, well, I'm not going to do that, and I advise other people to stay away from it. Anyway, that's all for now. If you're listening on YouTube, you can download my full translation of the Qur'an free using the button in the top right hand corner, or buy the hard copy there at 10% less than on Amazon. I also encourage you to sign up for the Qur'anite Plus newsletter on the site to get occasional micro updates. You can download the audio from my YouTube videos to your mobile device using the links in the drop down below. I recommend meetquranites.com to connect with other Qur'an alone believers. Like if you like, comment if you have something constructive to say, and subscribe to get more each week. And use the link in the drop down below to donate if you would like to help me keep doing this. And remember, this life is short, eternity is long. If you want good trees, plant good seeds.